And well, the case to when it comes to negotiating with Canada and the United States to reach a trade deal before President Trump's 50% tariff takes effect is fast approaching. You have the Canadian negotiators that are racing to reach at least an interim agreement with the United States before President Trump's new 50% tariff that takes effect on August 19th. Now, the duties will cover approximately $20 billion USD in Canadian exports and could open more damaging phase of a trade dispute. Now, Ottawa is reportedly considering concessions involving automobiles, dairy quotas, the United States, alcohol, and in return, Canada is seeking relief from American tariffs affecting important Canadian industries, which would include steel and aluminum. Now, this is significant because the new tariffs are scheduled to take effect August 19th, around the corner, and that represents roughly 5% of US imports from Canada recorded in 2025. Now, the products include wine, beer, dairy, goods, as well as cement, clothing, furniture, honey, seeds, and hockey equipment. Now, the measures were issued under Section 338 of the U.S. Tariff Act of 1930. This is the first major use of that provision in nearly a century. Now, the new duties will apply even to some goods that previously received tariff protection under CUSMA. So if you recall, July 1st deadline to renew CUSMA for 16 years came and passed, and the United States said that they were not interested. So that means that the CUSMA trade review will take place annually. Now, negotiators are reportedly meeting regularly as the deadline approaches, and Canada says that retaliation remains an option if the negotiations fail. So now, according to anonymous sources that have reported that Ottawa is discussing several possible concessions, right? So that would be either removing or reducing Canadian counter tariffs on US made vehicles, as well as accepting elements of Washington's position on dairy import quotas, which is very significant for the supply management when it comes to the dairy industry in Canada, as well as facilitating the return of American alcohol back to the shelves in the provincial liquor stores, and also addressing US complaints about discriminatory treatment of American products. So those are some of the concessions that have been reported that Ottawa is looking at, as well as incorporating some of concessions into the broader CUSMA review that is now scheduled annually. Now, these proposals have not been publicly finalized, and the Canadian government has not confirmed that it will accept them. But this is what's been reported in terms of what is coming out of Ottawa right now in terms of what's on the table in negotiations. Now, when it comes to the alcohol issue, it is particularly complicated because provincial governments, not just Ottawa, control most of the liquor purchasing and the retail systems. For example, in Ontario, it's the LCBO. Now, the federal government cannot simply order every province to resume buying American products. Like, for example, here in Ontario, when the US alcohol was removed from the shelves, well, that was about a significant amount that is now in storage. So now that depends on the Premier of Ontario to put it back on shelves at the LCBO. So now, in exchange for concessions, Ottawa is reportedly seeking a reduction in US tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum and relief for the integrated automotive sector, which is very significant for provinces like Ontario and Quebec, as well as a protection for CUSMA compliant exports. Now, the greater certainty for Canadian businesses is of a major issue because Canadian businesses cannot essentially plan their operating costs or essentially really their business overhead if they don't know if their business is going to be affected by the tariffs. Now, this comprehensive agreement is very significant, but it is seen as a series of temporary exemptions to what would be a greater deal when it comes onto CUSMA. Now, when it comes to having more predictability, it is important when it comes to the CUSMA review. Now, the Canadian Trade Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, he's described essentially recent meetings with the U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer as constructive and detailed, but neither government has announced a breakthrough, which is what Canadians are waiting to hear about. Now, the White House has accused Canada of discriminating against American products through provincial restrictions when it comes to US alcohol, as well as Canadian counter tariffs on American vehicles and dairy supply management rules when it comes to quota allocations and price restrictions. Essentially, the United States saying that they don't have access to the Canadian market and at a competitive rate when it comes to the Canadian dairy industry. Now, the broader retaliations against previous US trade measures are also something that the United States is taking an issue with when it comes to the Trump administration. Now, they're also saying that Canadian imports of US alcohol beverages fell approximately 81%, or when it comes to US dollar value, that's about $582 million between the months of March 2025 to February of 2026. The US administration has also said that imports of American vehicles fell by 22%, or when it comes to a dollar value, that's about $5.6 billion USD over the same period of time. Now, Canada argues that many of its measures were introduced in response to earlier American tariffs. If you recall, when President Trump came into office last year, well, he announced his tariffs, and Canada immediately announced counter tariffs, and that was when it was Prime Minister Justin Trudeau with the counter tariff. So this is all part of what is the contentious issue on this. Now, this is significant because you have President Trump that's invoked Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, which permits the president to impose duties on countries determined to discriminate against U.S. commerce. So this is what he's using to be able to bypass CUSMA, essentially what would have been safeguarded under the CUSMA agreement, which is a trade agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Well, this section of the Tariff Act of 1930 bypasses all of that. So now the law has rarely been used and has not been meaningfully tested under modern trade agreements. So now legal analysts say that tariffs could face challenges because when you have Section 338, it predates CUSMA and the modern international trading system. So now Congress adopted more detailed trade remedy procedures after 1930, but when it comes to targeted goods, well, that's going to be the issue that Canada will have to deal with. Now, this is also a legal challenge that would not necessarily stop tariffs from taking effect while litigation proceeds, but essentially when decisions are made by judges, well, then it could essentially stop the tariffs. But now there's also a lot of rumors that maybe President Trump will not proceed with his August 18th 19 threats, but that's to be seen as negotiations are taking place. Because you have Prime Minister Mark Carney, he's saying that everything is on the table, although Ottawa has not announced a final response. But the possible measure could include a dollar for dollar counter tariff on US goods, expanded restrictions on American government contracts, as well as limiting involving critical minerals as well as energy exports. Now, additional provincial restrictions on American alcohol might continue as a response. And when it comes to what would be the legal challenges that will take place under CUSMA and domestic US law. So these are the items that the Prime Minister says that he's looking into if this negotiations don't go well and as the deadline is fast approaching. But just to take into consideration what would be the economic impact, it's very significant as the United States receives approximately 72% of Canada's merchandise exports, which essentially leaves Canadian producers highly exposed to sudden changes in American trade policy. Canada relies on America as its #1 trading partner. So now this new tariff could make Canadian products substantially more expensive in the United States. It might reduce orders for Canadian manufacturers as well as agriculture producers. And it would force companies to cut production, investment, and what it means to that's headcount unemployment. Now, this disruption would, of course, have a supply chain spanning on both countries. But when you have prices raised that significantly by 50%, that will affect the American customers as well as businesses. Now, this increased pressure is, of course, on the Canadian dollar, and it weakens the business's confidence ahead of the CUSMA review, which is scheduled for annual review. Now, the overall U.S. economic impact may be limited by size of the targeted list, but when it comes to individual regions as well as businesses could be hit severely. So this is significant because essentially what could happen next is you have three broad outcomes that remain possible. First one being there could be an interim agreement where both countries suspend some tariffs and continue negotiations, as well as a comprehensive deal. The second outcome could be a temporary delay where President Trump postpones the August 19th measures without resolving the underlying disputes. And the third one being escalation, which I think that would just, what it would be is it would escalate the situation where you would have tariffs take effect and Canada responds with additional countermeasures. And then who knows what the end of that will be, as it'll affect not only the businesses and the economy, but the average Canadian as well as the average American. But more significantly for Canada, because Canada relies on 70 to 75% of its exports go to the United States. So any immediate agreement would likely serve as a bridge to a broader CUSMA review rather than what would be a permanent settlement between Canada and United States trade tensions. So this is something that we're keeping an eye on. Of course, we're going to bring you the development as this takes place, as the deadline is fast approaching.